So as it was said yesterday, these are two organizations coming together, the Critical Muslim Studies, and we welcome them here for this morning with us. And Dr. Ramon Grosfoguel will start the discussion this morning. We have also the 2 hours this afternoon. The 2 hours this afternoon are going to be at 4 o'clock and not 4:30 here. And this is, I think, for our group, because the others are going to Umrah to the Alhambra this afternoon. So this will be among our group at 4 o'clock. Okay? And Ramon hopefully will be with us, inshallah, this afternoon. So the 3 speakers will be there, even though not all of the students or the people who registered are going to be there. And I know that some of you are qualified, overqualified. So if I say students, smile. That's not all students, everybody here. So don't take it as downgrading your status. Quite the opposite, by the way, if you take it in the right way. So, Ramon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Salam alaikum to all. I want to thank the CILE project and for these joint events. We are 2 different summer schools, and I want to reiterate this because there was some confusion in among a few of you. And so we are, in a sense, having different emphasis in the 2 schools. And so that is, I think, reflected in the panels, etc. But I think that the panels is useful maybe because of that diversity that it comes in the discussion. That is always useful to have different points of view. What I'm going to talk this morning is related to some fundamental questions that I'm going to go in detail. That's already in our seminar. We already began that conversation, but I'm going to come back to the main questions, which is the world historical significance of the conquest of Alandalus. Many times we take that as some kind of, let's put it this way, melancholic and romantic or, sad story that we carry on into the present, and you could see that a lot among the Muslims in the world, no matter where you go, this memory of the loss of Andalusia, of Al-Andalus. And what I want to do is kind of take it beyond in the sense of look at the world historical significance of the fall of Al-Andalus in the sense of what kind of effects this had over the modern world we live today, okay? And because, in fact, some of the methods used in the conquest of Al-Andalus were extrapolated to other parts of the world. And so if you want to look at the history of the European colonial expansion in its particularities, you could see some of the beginnings of that in the conquest of Al-Andalus. I will say that the conquest of Al-Andalus was the beginning of the European colonial expansion that is going to later move to the Americas and later to other parts of the world. But I'm going to pose a few questions that are relevant to what I'm going to talk today, which is, if you look carefully, you're going to see that the structures of knowledge of the modern world, or the westernized university, I call the westernized university this global structure of power that you can see, and I call it Western. I didn't say Western because today is everywhere. After 500 years of European colonial expansion, you have westernized university everywhere around the world. And so the European colonial, the westernized university has a very particular structure of knowledge. If you watch carefully, the structure of knowledge of the Western University, doesn't matter which discipline you go, is usually Western males of 5 countries, which is astonishing. The first time I heard that was an observation that I heard from Portuguese sociologist Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who made that observation And the first time I heard that, it kind of shocked me, because I thought maybe this is exaggerated, but when you look carefully, the canon of thought of all the disciplines in the human sciences, social science, humanities, etc., is based on males of 5 countries, which is kind of shocking when you think about that we are in the 21st century and the world is very is large and diverse. And it's not as if people elsewhere haven't thought about these questions, okay? And it's fundamentally French, German, British, Americans, and secondarily Italians. But fundamentally, these are the people you read. It doesn't matter where you go around the world. If you go to a Western university in New York, Paris, London, Dakar, New Delhi, Buenos Aires, Rio de Janeiro, you enter the classroom and you're going to read the same guys, which is like, wow, this is amazing, no? And so I look at the Western University as a global structure of power that is part of this machinery of producing Westernized elites all over the world, in the global north and in the global south. And especially in the global south is fundamental, because once you don't have any more colonial administrations running the show, now with the anti-colonial struggles, etc., now you have what has been called by Kwame Nkrumah neo-colonial structures in most of the world, okay? And so these neo-colonial structures require Westernized elites from the home countries doing the job, you know? And that's part of the colonizing the, the minds of the elites in the third world, that becomes a fundamental for the functioning of neoliberal policies, functioning of foreign policy of many of the global north imperial countries, okay? So, so this Western University, I call it as a very fundamental structure of, of the global system today. You cannot just go, take it on the side, because it's constitutive of the international division of labor of, metropolitan centers, peripheral regions, etc. But coming back to the question, that observation of Boaventura Sousa Santos of, males of 5 countries monopolizing what is truth, what is reality, and what is good for you, I call this structure a foundational structure, epistemically speaking, as a racist, sexist epistemology. Why I'm calling it this way? Because this structure inferiorizes knowledge produced in other regions of the world, okay? And in other epistemic perspectives, and in other universities around the world. Even people who are thinking within the framework of Westernized university and are producing knowledge along those lines in other parts of the world, they are excluded, they are inferiorized relative to Western males of 5 countries, okay? And women, of course, are completely out, even the women of the 5 countries, okay? And it's not as if women haven't produced critical knowledge about political science, economy, or sociology, or whatever, okay? Or philosophy or history. And it's not as if people elsewhere around the world haven't produced knowledge, even within the framework of the Western University, not to talk about people who produce knowledge outside that framework, that is beyond the Eurocentric paradigm, taking seriously traditions of thought that are categorized in the West as non-Western perspectives, no? So the question for me became these observations, I then raised a word historical question, okay, which is, how did we get there? This is not a natural phenomenon. I mean, something happened in history at some point to have structures of knowledge so provincial, disguised as universal, so racist and sexist, okay, and so narrow, okay? So what happened? When did this happen? Where is this coming from, And so this is where I raise the question as a world historical question. Since when this happened? How come males of high country have monopolized the structures of knowledge of the modern world? Okay? And here is where I go back in history and I look at 4 genocides, epistemicides that happened in the long 16th century. Long 16th century is what some historians define as 1450 to 1650. These 200 years described as the long 16th century because there are structures that emerge out of those 200 years that historians name as a long century, of 200 years, because it's kind of the formation of what we call today modernity, the modern world, and all these things, okay? When you look at that moment in history, there are 4 genocide epistemicides that happen at that moment in history that are fundamental to look at carefully, and that are constitutive of the structures of knowledge of the modern world, okay? You have, on the one hand, and this is what I'm going to discuss here now, is I'm going to just make a brief statement so you get an idea of where I'm going. So the conquest of Alandalus against Muslims and Jews too, okay? The conquest of the Americas against indigenous people and Africans, okay, which is another genocide epistemicide. And another genocide epistemicide usually is not put in conversation that happened at the same time, which is amazing, against women. And I'm talking specifically about the women in Europe that were accused of being witches and burnt alive, okay? All this happened at the same time. What happened in let's put it this way, in Eurocentric scholarship is that they look at this as fragments and they don't look at the broader picture. They're like looking at the conquest of Al-Andalus here, and then you have historians and people specialize on that. Then you have the ones on the conquest of the Americas, then other people working on the conquest of women, the kidnapping, mass kidnapping of African and enslavement in the Americas, and as separate from each other. At the most, the people working in one of them kind of link a little what is happening there, but not between the whole thing. So what I try to do is put in conversations. I'm coming from a colony of the Americans, Puerto Rico, and I live in this border between the American world and the Latin American world, okay? And therefore, when I came this way to Granada, for me, Granada was a very revealing space because being in Granada, I could start seeing things of the conquest of the Americas that I thought, and we think in the Americas, in Latin America and North America, that they are original of the conquest of the Americas. And then I discovered, no, they began here, a lot of these things, okay? So this is where I start like putting the conversation when I began to visit Granada several years ago, like 7 years, 8 years ago. And so what I'm going to do now, keep now please in mind the question that we're asking, how did we get to these narrow structures of knowledge? Because I'm going to now go over a narrative that might seem that I got lost in the narrative, but we're coming back to it, and you see what I mean as we go along. We're coming back to answer the question, okay? But I think it requires, an answer that goes over a historical account to understand why we have these structures of knowledge today. Now, when I say genocide epistemicide, I'm talking about, of course, the physical elimination and the cleansing of populations and humans, okay? But also the destruction of knowledge, okay? When I say epistemicide, it's the attempt at destructing the knowledge of the people are being colonized in this European colonial expansion. And so when I say epistemicide, it's not that those knowledge have disappeared completely, okay? We know that they were not successful. If there was something they were not successful, it was at completely destroying this epistemic diversity of the world. They destroyed the civilizations. I don't think there's any more multiple civilizations. There's only one that have colonized the others and have destroyed the other, and therefore to talk about clash of civilizations, I find it nonsense, okay? So we are under one civilization today that has colonized and destroyed the others, and everybody's within, but at the level of subjectivity, spirituality, etc., there is something there that they couldn't succeed in destroying, and one of it is epistemic diversity. But what the epistemic side achieved was to create a hierarchy of superiority, inferiority at the level, not just of economy, politics, etc., but at the level of knowledge, okay? So, for example, let's begin with the Conquest of Alandalus. That, I think, is the first moment, okay? So for us, in decolonial thinking, 1492 is a major date, a foundational date, is the spirit this way, in the way we look at the modern world, okay? And not that there were not things happening before that also carry on into the present, but this is a fundamental moment because of the world historical structure and the globalization of things that were local or regional in other parts of the world and then suddenly became global. So let's begin with the Conquest of Alandalus. To talk about the Conquest of Alandalus, I don't have the time here now to go over, because we will have to go to the transformation from Unitarian Christianity to Trinitarian Christianity and all of that. I don't have the time, but to make a long story short, basically I want to describe what was being destroyed and what was replacing what was being destroyed. Okay. What replaced it. And so to do that, we need to go over, I have lectured on this in the other summer school in detail, but we don't have the time here to do that. So I'm going to just go over a laundry list of differences so you understand that the forms of political authority that existed in Christian Europe at the time, which I call Christendom, because there is a transition from Christianity to Christendom in this transition from Unitarian Christianity to Trinitarian Christianity, which is when in the Roman Empire, Constantine adopted, if you cannot fight them, join them, so adopted Christianity as the ideology of the state. That's Christendom, that's not the spirituality anymore. We're talking about now Christianity becoming the ideology of a power structure, which is it's not the same as Christianity as a spirituality. We're talking now about a power structure, and in doing that transformation, he needed to transform the theology. He couldn't continue with the old theology because the old theology was really revolutionary, because it was the idea of, in Islam you have it, Tawhid, no? Tawhid, which is, this idea was already in Unitarian Christianity, and that idea was already putting into question in a radical way the power of the emperor and the Romans, because it's basically calling attention that, okay, you're not sacred, you're an earthly power structure, and therefore, it was desacralizing the Roman Empire, and therefore the attempt of the emperor, 4 centuries later, was to say you cannot fight and join them. But in joining them, they couldn't continue. They have to change the theology. That's when the theology went from Unitarian Christianity to Trinitarian. And the Trinitarian posed there a dualism, okay, a dualism. I don't have the time to develop that, but just to say that this is important to understand some of the forms of political authority that were put forward, okay, by Christendom. Under the Roman Empire, and later when the Roman Empire fell, you have the emergence of feudal lords all over Europe, the fragmentation, but continuing with Christendom as the central ideology and the central form of political authority. Now, in Christendom, because they imposed this dualism of the goods and the bads, destroying the notion of unity, then difference within unity, then it was a form of political authority that understood unity as homogeneous, not as heterogeneous. That is, the notion of difference within unity was destroyed with this Trinitarian notion, and then as an instrumental form of power, they pushed to the side of evil anything that was different or that was threatening to the empire, okay? So the notion of unity, different within unity or Tawhid, was very important in the sense of becoming an important tool for also not only spirituality, but also critiques to the empire that, you know, you're not sacred, you know, you are just an earthly form of power, you're committing all these injustices, and we're criticizing you because we don't see you as sacred, you know, and part of the move of Constantine was to say, well, we are sacred, we're the representatives of God on earth, you know. The analogy of the Trinitarian idea, you know, was put forward to resacralize the empire. So what happened was that then you have a form of political authority that first, in terms of knowledge production, you have on the one side the Christian authorities that were practicing Christendom under Trinitarian Christianity, in which if you were scientist, philosopher, etc., you were a threat. That is, you were perceived as a threat because you were pushed to the side of evil. Anything material is evil, anything spiritual, then it's the goods, okay? And so you have the goods and the bads here, and anything that was critical or anything that was different from the dogmas, hegemonic dogmas, was pushed to the side of evil, and then you were submitted either to be crucified or later to be burned alive, okay? So scientists, philosophers, etc., the Greeks were forbidden in Christian Europe over 1,000 years. I mean, this is important to say, because later they're going to invent a narrative as if the origins of the West is there in the Greeks, you know, and it's an invention of the 17th, 18th century to create the idea of the superiority of the West over the rest, you know, when in fact all the Greeks arrived this way through the Muslim philosophers of Andalusia, of Al-Andalus. But all these histories get completely distorted, and the idea, I mean, when you look at the Greeks, for example, they were forbidden for 1,000 years here. I mean, after Constantine, Christian Europe fell into an obscurantist period of 1,200 years, okay? And in terms of knowledge, while in the 8th century, Muslims are right, this is another long discussion I already developed in the other summer school, but I cannot develop here, which is I question in a radical way this thesis of the reconquest that is used by the Christian monarchy in the conquest of Al-Andalus, that there was some conquest of the Muslims and now we're recovering what was taken away from us. This is like some kind of innocent power that is coming back to recover what was lost. In fact, I sustain the thesis, and that's a long discussion, maybe we can come back later in the discussion, that there was no conquest, first of Spain. Even if you sustain the thesis of a conquest of Spain, there's no conquest of Spain, because Spain did not exist in the 8th century. Okay? Let's begin there. And then even if you take the idea of, the idea of conquest itself, is very problematic to think about what happened at that moment in time as a conquest, okay? That's a long story, I cannot go in details. We can come back to it later, okay? I'm not evading, because those of you who took my course last Monday, you heard my arguments, but we can come back to it. And it's not to say that there was no conquest in Islamic civilization. Of course it was, but in the case of what happened here, to call it a conquest, and by the way, I think your father gave you the name out of inspired in Tariq, no? Anyway, so to call it a conquest is really problematic, okay? And we can leave that for now. So we're now in the late 15th century. Here you have two forms of power. In one, scientists and philosophers were celebrated, partly because the notion of Tawhid was important in the sense of, anything, there's no dualism between spiritual and material world, and therefore if you discover something in other forms of life or in nature, whatever, that is part of the creation of Allah, and therefore it's celebrated because you have discovered something we didn't know. In the other side, if you discover something that was going to threaten the dogmas, then you are seen as a threat. You're in the side of evil, they burn you alive. So this is one of the things that was in contrast between the two forms of political authority, was about knowledge production, okay? Just keep in mind that the largest library of Christian Europe at the time did not have 1,000 books, okay? The Library of Cordoba had more than 500,000. The Library of Granada, that they burned it here in Plaza Ribambla, no? What's the name? Huh? Ribambla. It's here next to a few blocks from here, where Cardinal Cisneros burned all these books. They had 250,000 books, okay? Just the contrast in knowledge is, you could see by the numbers of books in libraries in the two sites in this territory, you know, in Europe at the time. And then you have another difference, which is how do you treat minorities and rights of minorities? In Christendom, because of the notion of dualistic notion that you have, you know, difference is pushed to the side of evil, and then the material world, and then the spiritual world is perceived as unity without difference, homogeneous unity. Therefore, we are all Christians, and you are something else, and we push you to the other side of the fence, okay? That division was fundamental for the persecution of Jews over centuries in Europe, the persecution of minorities, of people who were practicing other spiritualities, you name it, okay? On the other side, there was the recognition of the people of the book, no? And the recognition of rights of people of other spiritualities. And so you have, with all the tension that at some moments in history you can find, there was no pogroms, okay, of people in the way that happened in the other side first, and second, there was a recognition of that difference in the forms of political authority that existed in Al-Andalus, okay? Then you have another difference in relation to women. Women in this Christendom political structure were perceived as part of evil, okay? And even women of Christian origin, etc., they were like suspicious of being close to evil. And so to talk about women's rights or to talk about divorce or things like that did not exist. In the Christian world, divorce is something that is a 20th century thing, okay? All of that was already recognized, you know, like divorce and women's rights in the other side in Al-Andalus, with all the limits that we can see today when we look back, anachronistically back, you know, you could say, well, there were some limits there, but when you compare what was there, you know, next to it, it was much better and advanced for the times than what it was in the other side, okay? So these were forms of political authority that were, you know, one next to the other, you know, in this side of the world, but they were completely different from each other in the way they operated. Now, in the feudal structures, the Lord is the representative of God on earth. So there is some kind of, there's an idolatric notion there of the feudal Lord being some kind of, the analogy of Trinitarian Christianity. You know, the same way God has a son, there is this lords, feudal lords, that were godlike in that sense, okay? Here, when you go to Alhambra, that I think all of you are going today, you will see that in the walls it says the victory is only of Allah, which is a way of reminding the Sultan that you're not God, okay? You're not God. And whatever good things happen under your rule is you have to be a recognition of a power that is beyond you. Okay, so that you could see in the walls when you go today in Alhambra. So I'm just going very rapidly and superficially over these things, just to say that when, at the late 15th century, the last remaining space that existed of that history of Al-Andalus was Granada, okay? And it was not a kingdom, okay? Granada was a sultanate, okay? It was not a kingdom. Usually you hear in the literature the kingdom of Granada. It's not a kingdom, it was a sultanate. And so what you have was the Christians, it was a 10-year war here in Granada, and there was this, one of the things they were doing when they conquered the territory of Al-Andalus, and they were doing that over several centuries, was basically to force conversion on Jews and the Muslims. The forced conversion, either you convert and you become part of that unity without difference, and you're all Christians now, or you're pushed to the side of evil, and therefore you're going to be killed. Okay, so this was the options, and then of course many Muslim and Jews run away to Muslim lands. We have to remind that the Jews were running away to Muslim lands, because Zionist historiography today is doing revisionist history and make us believe that the problem in Palestine today is some kind of eternal problem between Jews and Muslims, and the Muslims are the more anti-Semite people in the world, etc., when in fact, over centuries, Jews were running away to Muslim lands, okay, because of the pogroms in Christian Europe, all the way till 1945, okay? So we have to keep that in mind, because why they were running to Muslim lands if they were the worst anti-Semites and if they were going to be killed there, etc. I mean, this is nonsense, but this is the kind of thing you hear today. Anyway, so a lot of you have here the beginning when they conquered the land. What they did was to force conversion, kill those who did not convert, and then the other ones run away to Muslim lands. Now, they imposed a structure that is called the Encomienda. The Encomienda is a structure of forced labor, but also forced conversion. The encomendero, they will take the land away from the Muslim and Jews, they will take their properties away, and then they will be forced to work for the encomendero. The encomendero was in charge of not only surveilling the forced labor, but also surveilling their conversion to Christianity. And I'm saying the encomendero because for those of you who knows more the Americas, we always think about the encomienda as something that began in the Americas with indigenous people in the Americas as a system of oppression, and it began here in Al-Andalus. What they did was to transfer it later to the Americas when they colonized the Americas, but it began here. And this, in the literature today, we call it settler colonialism. That is, you have the colonizer coming, taking over the land, wiping out and cleansing the land away from indigenous people, and then giving the land to the colonizer and families who will arrive, settle there, take over the land, their properties, their houses, etc., and then put them to work. Those who survived and were forced to convert, they were being put to work under a coerced forms of labor under the encomienda and surveilled in their conversion. They will be surveilled the whole time about if they are converting or they're faking conversion. Okay, so for those of you who knows a little about the work of Michel Foucault, I will say that with the permission of Foucault and the Foucaultians, biopolitics began in the 15th century and not in 19th century France, because Foucault was not Eurocentric, was French-centric, was so French-centric that he didn't know, if he would have been Eurocentric, it would have been better, because he would have known at least European history, will know that biopolitics and surveillance of population, all of this began in the 15th century here. Anyway, he put it in place in France in the 19th century. But the point is that you have now the settler colonialism and the taking away of land, subordination of the population. Those who converted will be called Moriscos. Muslims turned into Moriscos, and those who converted from the Jewish, they were called Marranos, okay? Marranos. These are the two new identities that emerged of this process, okay? Now, these settler colonial structures, you're going to see this method applied for the next 500 years in European colonial expansion in many parts of the world, okay? All the way to Palestine today, okay? So this is, I'm just talking about the world historical significance of the Conquest of Alandalus is also in relation to the structures of power and the methods of colonization that they carry then into other parts of the world, okay? Some of these things you could identify happening here or there, isolated, in many parts of the world, but to become a global system of colonization is something that happened, you know, from the Conquest of Alandalus on with the European colonial expansion elsewhere. So all these methods were carried on. There was another method, which is the burning of the libraries, okay? The burning of the libraries was, I would call it the epistemicide, okay? Destruction of knowledge. And today we have a language for that. You delete the chip, no? The chip of the computer, and then you reprogram it with a new program, you know, and this is what, with that language, we understand that what they were doing was trying to erase the memory, erase the memory of that history, of their knowledge, structures, etc., so that after 2-3 generations, people will have no access to what was, and then you put a new chip with a new program, you reprogram the mind, and then you have a colonized subject, okay? And so with a new narrative of history, new identity, other different memory, etc. And while they were burning the library, we have to say that, they were selectively burning the libraries, because there were also, Cardinal Cisneros was next to someone who could read Arabic and take the books that they found curious about technology, science, and things like this, and put it on the side, send it to Toledo, later to Rome, and that's how many of these books ended up in the Christian Europe that later are going to be at the foundation of modern sciences. We celebrate Copernicus at the origin of the theory of that the Earth is not the center of the universe, the Earth goes around the sun, etc. But in fact, Copernicus took a lot of this knowledge from the school of Baghdad that 600 years before has demonstrated this mathematically, with diagrams, everything. You could read the book of George Sullivan on this, historian of science at Columbia University, that on this question, you know, if you want to read more about that. But it's just an example of many other things with philosophy, different fields of science, etc. All these books were carried into Christian Europe and later used as foundation for knowledge that is going to be further developed by the West. But then what they're going to do is erase the origins of all of this and make it seem as something naturally and inherently European, you see, and make people believe that the rest of the world have no science, are inferior, etc. Okay? So this part also of the mechanism of colonization is to inferiorize the knowledge of the others, okay? And what they will do is then create a new memory, a new narrative of history, new identities, etc., that is going to be fundamental for the new subjectivities that they want to create in the colonized populations. And so, so with this epistemicide, they will be burning the libraries. Okay? These methods that I'm being describing for Al-Andalus are going to be carried over into the conquest of America. Now, there is a moment when Columbus comes here and meets with the king and the queen. I believe the first meeting was in Santa Fe, a few kilometers from here, while the war was going for conquering Granada. And there Columbus comes with the enterprise of the Indies, which is the plan to, okay, at that time, the competition of European empires was, okay, how are you going to get faster to the routes of the East? Because material production was not here. Europe was a very isolated village of the world. So what they were doing was the center of world production was in the East. And so the competition between the empire was who got there faster to bring the commodities from there and sold them for a profit here. That was the whole thing. Here, production was at a very limited level, okay? So the Portuguese control already through the coast of Africa, to go to the east. The Venetians have the access over the Mediterranean. The Ottomans emerge in the mid-15th century and have control over that side, you know. And so here comes Columbus and tells the Spanish monarchy, hey, you can go this other way, okay? Through the Atlantic. Now, the reality is that he was coming with some maps, okay? This idea that he was risking his life because the Earth was thought to be, plane, and he would go like this, This is things we learn in the fairy tales we learn in school, but in fact, everybody knew at the time, especially Islamic scientists, have already demonstrated that war was rounded, and And they knew that. So they have maps. Some of these maps have arrived to, that's why the navigators of the conquest were all Italians, okay? Because they all have access to these secret maps through the missions of the Vatican in other parts of the world. So they were over there, and so they were going around. And by the way, Columbus traded with maps. So we know that there was a map of the world done by the Chinese, done also by Muslim navigators, you know, where you could see the Americas in those maps, way before Columbus, okay? I cannot go in detail into that. But the point is that they were, he showed this thing to the Queen. The Queen said, this is great, but first step is to destroy Granada, unify the Iberian Peninsula under one crown, okay? And then we can go to this place. And he called it India, because at that time, nobody could read those maps in Europe, okay? So what he saw there, Columbus said, this is India, it's close to China, this is the way for us, you know, for you to get to the east faster than these other empires, you know? And he called it India. That's why today we call indigenous people in America Indios, Indians, because of this geographical mistake of Columbus. But so here comes, in this meeting, so they wait a few, I believe 2 more years, then Granada fell January 2, 1492. 9 days later, January 11, 1492, you saw the statue at the end of this avenue of Columbus giving the document to the Queen Elizabeth, and that happened now in a room of Alhambra, where after conquering Alhambra, 9 days later comes Columbus. He was stationed in Santa Fe, waiting for the fall of Granada to meet with the Queen, following the promise of the Queen. Now the Queen gave him the money and the royal authorization to go to what they thought it was India, okay? So he goes over the Atlantic, and 10 months later, October 12, 1492, he arrives to the Caribbean, the Americas, etc. Okay? Now, in his diary, the first thing he puts in his diary, October 12, 1492, and you could check that out, he said, these are people without sect. Sect, S-E-C-T, meant at the time without religion, okay? If I say people without religion today, you, in 21st century, say, oh, they were atheists. Okay? But at the end of the 15th century, in Christian imaginary, all humans have religion. You might have the wrong one. I might kill you for that. I might, if I want to impose, I'm going to impose mine on you because mine is the truthful, etc. But you're still a human because I still consider conversion. The problem with people without sect is a new concept. That means if you don't have a religion, you don't have a God. If you don't have a God, you don't have a soul. And if you don't have a soul, you're an animal in nature, okay? This is what was behind this classification, okay, at the time. So that began a huge debate in the Spanish Empire. And it began inside the church because authority and knowledge was in the church. And there were already critical voices to this because, of course, they're animals. There's no sin in the eyes of God to put them to work by force in the labor process, okay? So it's like a cow or a horse or whatever, okay? So they immediately enslaved indigenous people in the Americas and were doing all these atrocities. So there were some theologians or some priests in the Americas, Montesino, Las Casas, etc., were already calling attention to it and say, hey, wait a minute, what if these people are human? You know, and maybe this is a sin, what we're doing, and we're all going to hell, okay? So what are we doing here? And putting in question this. So this debate began, but this, you could see the beginning of that in the diary of Columbus, okay? People with soul, people without soul. That was the first racial classification. We need to look at this carefully because before that moment, in the Conquest of Alandalus, that narrative was not there yet. It was a form of religious discrimination in which let's put it this way, the idea of the human was still there, extended to Muslim and Jews, etc. But the question was the theology, the God, etc. No? here comes a new question, which is people that have soul, people that doesn't. People are now below the line of the human, okay? And so now the Conquest of America began, and they brought all the methods. For example, they burned the codices, they burned the quipus, epistemicide, okay? They enslaved the people there, etc. Under the argument they were not, they have no soul, etc. Slavery now is different from slavery in other moments in history, including Islamic civilization, okay? Not that I celebrate other forms of slavery, but we have to be carefully not coming with transhistorical arguments as if modern slavery is the same as Muslim slavery, is the same as Roman slavery, which is Western academic historians love to do that, to come with transhistorical arguments, basically to say, after all, the West didn't do anything original. They just imitated the Muslims. They just imitated you see, and I want to argue that it's not the case, okay? There was something new happening in this modern slavery, and it has to be that it was racial slavery. And slaves have no rights, okay? That implies something completely different from what happened before. Not that I celebrate what happened before, okay? Don't get me wrong, but it's important to understand discontinuities in history and the logics of the social systems that emerged after that, okay? Now, in the Americas now, you have basically this debate went until 1552, the debate if they have a soul or not. Here you have Sepúlveda and Las Casas now, in a debate in 1552 where the king of Spain at the time put this in the hands of a theological tribunal. At the time, the church had the authority of knowledge and jurisprudence in the Spanish Empire. So he put it in the tribunal to decide if the methods of conquest of America were okay, correct, or if they were a sin in the eyes of God. Here you have the two positions. Here you have Sepúlveda arguing, well, these are people without soul. He takes that line and saying these are savages, barbarian, etc., and there's no sin in what we're doing there, so the conquest of America are justified, okay? Here comes the other position, which was Las Casas, saying they are humans, but they are in a barbarian stage, and what we need to do is to civilize, to Christianize them, This is the term he used. So you have people without soul and barbarians to be Christianized. Here you have the two lines of racism of the West for the next 450 years. In the 19th century, that with the authority of knowledge passing from Christianity to science or pseudoscience, people without soul turn into people without the DNA, okay? With biology and natural science. The line of Sepúlveda turned from people without soul to people without the DNA. The line of Las Casas of Christians, barbarians to be Christianized, turned with anthropology and the social science of 19th century into primitive to be civilized. Okay, now you could see that it's the same dog with different color, okay? So it's the same argument, just that the authority of knowledge was theology and was a form of theological racism at the beginning. Watch how the first moment of racism is not about color. That's not the marker in the first moment, okay? It was about a theological form of racism that classified population based if you have a soul or not, okay? Later, with scientific racism, this is going to be secularized, the theological argument, into a pseudo-scientific argument, and it's going to say, people without the human DNA, or primitive to be civilized, no? So here you have the Sepúlveda Las Casas line until today. We call the Sepúlveda line today biological racist discourses, and the Las Casas line, we call it cultural racist discourses, okay? These have been the discourses used by the West in many of their colonial enterprises around the world. In some places, they emphasize one over the other, or they might use the two, one against one group, one against the other. There are variations of this, but fundamentally, you have these two hegemonic discourses about classifying the other, okay? So now in this trial, they decide, in the long run, Sepúlveda won the trial, but in the short run, it was won by Las Casas. And so they decided that indigenous people were barbarians that need to be Christianized. So what did they do? Mid-16th century, they brought the Encomienda from the Conquest of Alandalus to the Americas. And then they put indigenous people to work on their core forms of labor called the Encomienda, and the encomendero is going to be in charge of the Christianization, not only surveying the labor, but also Christianizing them. Okay, so you could see there how the Conquest of Alandalus, again, moved now into the Americas with full force. And they were burning the libraries, They were the quipus and the codices of indigenous people. That was the form they archived the knowledge. We know now that the most precise calendar of the world at the time was the Mayas. And we know that, but we don't know how they got to that knowledge because they burned the codices. We don't know how they got to that, okay? So next decision of that trial, well, okay, if the indigenous people are going to be passed to the encomienda, a form of forced labor, away from slavery, who is going to do slavery now? Here comes the decision to bring the Africans. It's not a slave trade, it's a captive trade, because what they did was to organize a mass industry of kidnapping millions of people to bring them to the Americas to be enslaved in the Americas. So these are not slaves in the shores of Africa saying, take me to the Caribbean to a plantation, okay? This is, I mean, when you read the literature and you see these euphemistic terms, it looks like they were there asking to be taken to the Americas. They were kidnapped. Literally, free people being kidnapped in mass numbers. So they put forward an industry of kidnapping, okay? And then later they're going to say, it was the Africans themselves who enslaved you and sold you to slavery in America. That's not true. What they did, of course, was to use divide and rule. They used some people in Africa to help them to kidnap the others. That was it. But it was not the Africans. It was not an African enterprise, okay? This was a European enterprise. And of course, there's always Uncle Toms in any, colonized project. And therefore, you have some Africans participating, but it was a European enterprise, okay? And it was not that they went and took slaves, that there were slaves there, that then they bought them and take them to America. It was that they kidnapped the people, free people, and to the Americas to be enslaved there, okay? So now you have a process of genocide where millions of Africans were killed in the process of kidnapping, in the process of transportation to America, and in the enslavement of the Americans. And then you have epistemicide because they were forbidden from practicing their epistemology, knowledge, etc. The same thing happened with indigenous people. They were burning their archives, okay, like they did in Al-Andalus, okay? So, and then there is a another process, a fourth one, of conquest, which is the conquest of women, okay? Accused of being witches and burned alive. Thousands and thousands, okay? At the same time that all of this is happening, okay? So you have here, who were these women? They were basically indigenous women of this land, of Europe, that were carrying knowledge, ancestral knowledges, from generation to generation in an oral way, okay? There were no books to burn. The books were their bodies. So they burned their bodies, okay? That's what they did. There was no books that they wrote or anything. It was oral history, but these were women who had knowledge of, astronomy, biology, medicine, plants, many things, and they were perceived as a threat because that knowledge gave them power, and they were very empowered in peasant communities in Europe, and they went after them, pushed them to the side of evil, and burned them alive in mass numbers. So there was a process here of genocide, epistemicide happening, because they were going after destruction of knowledge, okay? In the case of this woman, because the accusation was that they have some knowledges that were close to evil, okay? So all of this each of these conquests will be 3 hours, 4 hours of a seminar. I'm going to finish with this point, of the description of the genocide epistemicide. But the point I want to finish is I want to say that by the time you have the foundation of modern philosophy and science with René Descartes, which is recognized as like the foundation or the origin of modern science and modern philosophy, when he says, I think, therefore I exist, okay? This I in Descartes, okay, this I, Descartes is going to claim that is able to produce a God-I view, okay? So this is an idolatric move, in a sense, because now he's placing the attributes of the Christian God into this I. So now this I is able to produce a knowledge beyond time and space, God-like, is a God-I view, universal in the sense that beyond any particularity, and unsituated, that is the image of the God of Christendom, which is an anthropocentric, idolatric image, which is an old European man floating in a cloud, watching you with a cane, and if you misbehave, hit you in the head, and you keep misbehaving, send you to hell. This is the image of Christendom, okay, of the God of Christendom. And so this image is going to be secularized into this I, and he's going to claim that the mind, to make this argument of God-I view, is going to use two arguments. Ontological dualism, the mind is somewhere, a different substance from the body, and is floating that the God of Christendom on condition somewhere in the air, okay, in a cloud, and therefore can produce a knowledge of all knowledge, or a point of view of all points of view, or a knowledge that is universal in the sense beyond of any particularity, valid for everybody, okay? So, and the other one is condition of possibility for the God-I view is methodological dualism, that is an internal monologue of the subject with himself, and the gender here is on purpose, with himself, that is going to be then at the center of the idea that through a monologue, internal monologue, the subject will arrive to certitude in knowledge, okay? And what if the subject produce knowledge within a body, okay? Then the whole argument of God-I view falls apart, because that means that you're thinking from within time and space, and therefore you're not God, okay? What if you produce knowledge dialogically, in dialogue with other human beings? Then the whole argument falls apart, because now you are, you're producing knowledge from a historical context and from a societal context. Yes, you are in time and space, you are in society, you are in history, etc. So your knowledge is limited. It cannot be godlike, okay? So, but that's why he needs this dualism, ontological dualism, and methodological solipsism. Now, who is this I? This is the question that Enrique Dussel, philosopher of the liberation in Latin America, is going to pose. Who is this I? Where is this I thinking from? Here you have Descartes in Amsterdam after the 30-year war, when Holland had displaced the Iberian Peninsula from the center of that world economy, world system emerged with the expansion to the Americas in 1492, okay? So you're going to have, at that moment, he's saying this is a world historical event. For the first time in world history, you have a philosophy founded on the idea of a human being godlike, okay? Being godlike. And that tradition is going to begin with this idolatric idea, taking God away and placing themselves in the side of God, and taking the attributes of God into themselves, okay? And he's saying, this arrogance, where is this coming from? And he's saying, the I think, therefore I exist, is preceded by 150 years of I conquered, therefore I exist, okay? Which means that the condition of possibility for someone in the mid-17th century to think of himself and found a philosophy that is going to continue over several hundred years, that is based on this idea of the idolatric I think, therefore I exist, is the I conquered, therefore I exist. The condition, or economic, political, military condition of possibility for that. And that I conquer is what constitutes the idolatric I think. And I will add to that a mediation between the I conquer and the idolatric I think. You don't have a necessary correspondence. You could have the I conquer without the idolatric I think, okay? What made the idolatric I think is the I exterminate, therefore I exist. That is the I exterminate is the mediation between the I conquer and the I the idolatric I think. Okay, I exterminate meaning genocide, epistemicide. You have put everybody else below the line of the human. You have destroyed their knowledge or attempted to destroy their knowledge to place them as inferior to your knowledge and to put yourself as a superior knowledge. Now, who is this I? This I is the imperial being. And it's the Western man that have already conquered the world, okay, and has put himself in the place of God now as the new foundation of knowledge, okay? And now you have, in the common sense of the 17th century, after the conquest of Al-Andalus, that I could not be a Muslim, that I could not be a Jew. After the conquest of America, that I could not be an African, that I could not be an indigenous person. After the burning alive of thousands of women in Europe accused of being witches, that I could not be a woman, not even a woman of the 5 countries, okay? Not even a European woman. Therefore, you have here in the genocide epistemicide of the long 16th century, the racial patriarchal structures that are going to be constitutive of this, the modern epistemology that is founded on epistemic racism, sexism, that is the inferiorization of everybody else and the superiorization of Western men. Now, why a 5 country? Because after the 30-year war, they have displaced the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, and subordinated it to the north of Europe when the center passed to northwestern Europe, to Amsterdam, okay? And now they're going to inferiorize even the Iberian Peninsula. Even all the categories used by the Spaniards against Muslims, Jews, etc., they're going to now use it against the Spaniards themselves. And so it's not only that the conquest of Al-Andalus influenced America, it's also that the conquest of the America influenced the conquest of Al-Andalus, because this topic or this idea of people without soul is going to come back to haunt the Morisco question in Spain. Because now they're not going to say, they're going to say that the problem with the Morisco, even though they were already 3rd, 4th generation Christians and baptized as Christians, they're going to say they are soulless people. That's in the 16th century. So it's not just that there is an influence of the conquest of Al-Andalus into America, it's that also the conquest of America brought a new narrative, which is this racial narrative, and are going to reclassify the population from people with the wrong religion and the wrong God to now a more fundamental question, which is these people are not humans. So it's irrelevant if they're Christians, if they have converted or whatever, that's irrelevant. And so they start enslaving them in mass numbers in the 16th century here in Andalusia, and later expelled in 1609 from the Iberian Peninsula. Okay, so here is the transformation of medieval forms of discrimination into racial discrimination. And now to finish, the question is, coming back to this question, the Humboldt University, the first one, secular university, was founded on this epistemic racism, sexism of the males of 5 countries in the late 18th century in Berlin. And thus the secular university, scientific secular university, is going to be globalized over the next 200 years, okay? With this epistemology that is founded on the 4th genocide epistemic side of the 16th century, and why we have these structures today, okay, in the 21st century. Carry on, so provincial, so racist, is also linked to the entanglement of these structures with global imperial designs. What does that mean? In the 16th century, Christianize or I kill you. Millions of people killed under that slogan. My knowledge is superior to you. Doesn't matter what you say about what is good for you. I know what is best for you. So if I have to kill you to save your soul from your barbarianism, I'll kill you. 19th century, civilize or I kill you. You're an obstacle to progress. You're an obstacle to civilization. So if I have to kill you to save civilization and progress, I'll kill you, okay? And you don't understand through peaceful means, then we use force. Millions of indigenous people killed in the 19th century in the name of civilize or I kill you. Late 20th century, develop or I kill you. You're underdeveloped, you're poor, here's the recipe to develop. Open your country to transnational corporations and financial capital to exploit your cheap labor and resources, and we move forward into development. Oh, you resist? CIA organized coup d'etat everywhere around the world, okay? And the killing of millions of people around the world, okay, in the name of develop or I kill you, with developmentalist military dictatorship, not just in Latin America, all over the world, Africa and Asia. And we have to say that because the image in many parts of the world is to think that this is a Latin American thing. No. In the first month in Indonesia, in 1965, they killed 1 million people. The first month of the coup d'etat in Indonesia. Okay, keep that in mind. Early 20th century, democratize or I kill you. You don't know democracy, you're authoritarian, you have an authoritarian culture. Of course, all these dictatorships were put by them under the develop or I kill you. But you have a culture that is authoritarian, okay? So I'm going to teach you democracy with tanks, airplanes, military airplanes, etc., okay? So anyway, this is just a summary of this. Thank you.
Okay, we will start straight. At the end, you talking about the present, you started being emotional. That's good. Okay, the floor is yours for 25 minutes, half an hour. There is a mic somewhere, so it's here. If we can, yeah. How do you want to do this? 5 questions, 3 questions, or
3 questions.
3 questions. Okay.
It's working?
Okay. Who is first? Okay. Should have someone helping, please. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ramon. That was great. And I really made some really good links there in terms of just my own kind of work in feminist studies and how important it is for people to be aware of their hidden histories and also the marginalization of women when it comes to intellectual endeavors. And like, you know, you can just see in the, like with the greatest discovery in the 20th century, the idea, like the modern DNA, the fact that, Rosalind Franklin's data, stolen data, was used as a basis for that discovery, but that's just been whitewashed by history. And so how important is it in terms of, like you talk about epistemicide, so it's the idea of destroying the cultural confidence of people. So how important is it just for Muslims to be aware of their hidden histories, their intellectual contributions, all of that in terms of the cultural confidence kind of building. And the second question is, I guess, a lot of the anti-colonial leaders of the mid-20th century, like people like Jinnah and Gandhi in India, they were a product of, they went to Oxford and they were educated in the language of the colonizers, but they used that language against the colonizers, so they subverted it. And so a lot of us here are products of Western universities, and we exist within certain knowledge structures. So how can we subvert that, even though we exist within it as well, in the same way, for example, I guess they did?
So here we are. You would be very emotional here, I'm sure. Well, can give it there, here.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm listening to you for the second year, and so some information is repeated, but still it's very informative and very emotional. What is your opinion? You mentioned about 4 epistemicides and genocides historical for the long 16th century. What is your opinion about what's going on in Syria now? Can we qualify that as the 5th epistemicide? Because that's a very rich historical area, and what was kept there, all the museums, artifacts, libraries, they are destroying, and most of them, of that history is destroyed.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm here, I'm from California, And I'm here because I've been very impressed with your lectures. My question is, so often when we speak of Andalusia, we speak of, you know, the Muslims discovering the teachings of the Greeks and all of that Greek information, and of libraries being sacked. We know that they sacked the libraries in Egypt as well, in ancient Kemet. We know they sacked the libraries of the Americas with the codices and whatnot. My question is, since I declare there is only one God, that means there is only one body of knowledge. And we should all, to me, I think, start at the beginning. And we know, I've heard very little about the truth of China, you know, that huge empire that existed for thousands of years, and also about the ancient Greeks and where they got their information from. We know that it came from ancient Kemet. Those papyri are available en masse. The Greeks went into ancient Kemet at least 2,000 years studying, and then they brought that information out of Kemet into Greece. And sometime later is when the Greek philosophy was rediscovered. So I would like to suggest that as we go through acquiring information, that we don't systematically exclude the most ancient of the truths that have been established. And that includes ancient Egypt, and it includes the huge, massive civilizations of ancient China. So I'd like you to address how it is that the Greeks happen to have so much information, and how Socrates ended up having to drink the poison hemlock because he was messing with what the Greeks wanted to believe. He was bringing the information from the Egyptian mystery system. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Let me begin by saying that I've been describing the structures of power and how they work and played out in the modern colonial world, or what we call modernity. Part of what happened is that we think of modernity as some kind, I mean, from the Eurocentric narrative, it's an emancipatory discourse, okay? It's something like a critical within the West to structures of power inside the West. But the problem is that all this movement, Renaissance, Enlightenment, and later the Scientificist project from 19th century on, until postmodernism today, they are all critiques inside that do not take into consideration the structures of imperialism and colonialism. That is, when they think about emancipation, they think about emancipation inside the walls. Okay, it's like the Athenian democracy at a world scale. That is, remember the metaphor of the Athenian democracy, the free citizens are inside the walls and the slaves outside, remember? So in a sense, the modernity is that. Modernity is that Athenian democracy at a world scale, okay? That is based on the shoulders of the enslavement and colonialism and exploitation of the rest of the world. And now you make emancipatory critiques inside, but without being interested in the emancipation of the people outside the walls. The people outside the world are the condition of possibility for your own privilege, wealth, liberties, etc. So now you say liberty, fraternity, equality, but within the walls, you see? And here is where all this modern critical thought from within the West falls short. It's not that there's nothing to learn from them. Of course there is things to learn. But they fall short because they're not thinking from a wider perspective of emancipation, liberation for humanity at large. They're thinking from within the narrow walls of Europe, okay? And that's still happening, you know? And then you have the epistemic racism, the arrogance of thinking that their thought is the one you need to emancipate yourself because the rest of the world have no thought or inferior thought, okay? And here is where then you have all these short circuits in conversation and communication. Even within the feminist camp, you have Islamic feminists, black feminists, indigenous feminism, challenging some of these Western-centric feminists, okay, who are coming with this global design, again, practicing epistemic racism, because then they're going to inferiorize the critical knowledge produced by women in other parts of the world about how they think about emancipation, etc., different from them. But then they're going to impose the Western way of feminism to, as an emancipatory discourse for the rest of the world. Well, the point I want to say is that modernity, from the point of view of the history, narrative history I'm presenting here, is not just an emancipatory project, but is also is a civilizational project, more than an emancipatory project. That is, I'm making a critique to this idea that modernity is an emancipatory project. Now, the problem with the whole thing is not that the structures are out there and we are here. Is that all these narratives have been internalized. And now decolonization is not anymore like we're fighting only power structure. We're also fighting inner structures. And you cannot do a project of liberation without fighting outer structure and inner structures at the same time. If you only fight outer structure and leave on the side inner structure, you become a Marxist. Okay? Because what is the Marxist assumption? You change the outer structure, that will change the inner structure in an automatic way. And that's a false perspective. It's a reductionist idea. The other side is you fight inner structure, and by fighting inner structure, you don't deal with outer structure, you don't deal with social injustices, you don't change the world, and then you become New Age. Okay, so, and here is where we have to come for a third way, and that third path is you fight outer structure, inner structure simultaneously. You're not just dealing with one or the other. You need to deal with both at the same time, because we're not just fighting the Western structures outside, but the West inside ourselves. That is, what are those things that we carry over this colonial modern history that are being internalized? Internalized to such an extent that now you have versions of Islam or versions of indigenous culture or versions of African culture that are Christianized or kill you. That reproduce again the same model of civilize or kill you of the West, but now internalize some kind of authentic whatever, okay? So I would just want to point to that because in my talk I was emphasizing on the global structure, outer structure, but we need to come back to the articulation with outer structure, inner structures, and how we are all affected by this. It's not that this is a European problem. This is a world problem. This is a problem that now we are all embedded in it, okay? Even if you are the colonial subject in the equation, you're not outside. We have 500 years of this, and it has been internalized. I can give you a metaphor of this that I think is a very powerful metaphor. When I went to Morocco, I saw that they were forbidding non-Muslims from entering mosque. And I was like surprised because I never heard that, you know? I mean, you could see in the tradition that non-Muslims were allowed to enter a mosque. Where is this coming from? Then some people were citing hadiths and whatever over there. I said, well, where is this coming from? I never heard of this. Well, General Lyoté, the general of the French general colonizing Morocco, passed a decree forbidding non-Muslims from entering mosques as part of this divide and rule, because mosques were a center of resistance. And so they didn't want the Jews, Christians, whatever, you know, meeting there and subverting. So they kept, the guy passed this decree, and now suddenly it's being internalized as some kind of authentic Islamic practice. This is a metaphor that I just want to throw there, because what I'm describing here as a Lyoté quote is what happened at the spiritual and epistemological level with colonization. That is, we cannot discuss today a lot of the structures that we see out there as authentic Islam or authentic indigenous or authentic African without understanding the hundreds of years of colonial history and how a lot of these things we're seeing today are embedded in that, and a lot of things are coming from there, okay? So the point I want to say is that cultural confidence, the epistemicide, constitute also the loss of the cultural confidence, okay? There are two roads. One is you try to imitate the West, because now suddenly you think there have something special there in modernity that makes you believe that now we have to be like them. We need to catch up, okay? And this happened with the Ottomans in the 19th century. I have no time to develop that, but in the Ottomans started, you know, trying to imitate the West to catch up, and then imitating a lot of things that were not Islamic and that were wrong and ended up where it ended, okay? Westernizing, no? Trying to, because they thought there was something intrinsic about the rise of the West that was good to imitate. No, what happened was they plundered the Americas. They plundered them. They plundered elsewhere. That's how the whole thing, they enslaved people. That's how they got industrial. That's how they stole knowledge, okay, from many parts of the world, and then further developed it. Why? Because they have the infrastructure, the wealth, and then destroy through colonialism the infrastructure of the other civilizations. And then, of course, science became a rise in a particular place in the world after colonialism. So these kind of things get lost, and then suddenly we start seeing something, we start fetishizing modernity, fetishizing in such a way that we think that, oh, we need to catch up. The other thing is, the other response to that is not to imitate, is that now you are anti-West. In a very radical way, you're anti-West, but in fact, what you're doing is just inverting the binaries that the West has imposed on you. So what you do is, I am anti-West, and so the West say, I am patriarchal, I am authoritarian, I am this. Well, yes, that's true, and so what? Mine is superior to you. And you just invert the binary imposed on you by the West, so you're more in the West now than the others are trying to imitate the West, okay? And this is the kind of the fundamentalist, quote-unquote, temptation, which is now you're anti-West so radical, you're just inverting the binaries, and you're still inside the West in the worst way, which is that you're now accepting everything the West has thrown on you. You see, that you're authoritarian, that you are against women's rights, that you are this, and then you accept the whole thing and just do like this. You see what I mean? This is another way that is not going anywhere, okay? And so, in terms of a lot of the national liberation movement were anti-colonial, but not decolonial. You see? They were not taking into consideration the question of epistemic diversity, of taking seriously the critical knowledge produced from other epistemic perspective, from other body politics of knowledge, from other geopolitics of knowledge. They were just, in a sense, taking the critical thought of the West as their tools to fight the West. But that has a limit, because then you create nation states that is going to reproduce everything you're fighting against, you know? And so, and then you have ideologies that are imitations of the West that end up, you know, entrapping you. That's one of the failures of national liberation movement, was that, okay? And in the Syria question, that's a long discussion, which I don't even want to begin, okay? Because it's a very complex discussion, but I can tell you that this thing that I've been describing here, you could see there, all these trends of those who think that we need to catch up with the West, and those who think that we are now super anti-West, but you're just reproducing the civilized or I kill you, Christianized or I kill you, now in the name of Islam. Islamicized or I kill you, okay? That's super Western, okay? That's modern, that's not medieval. That's not medieval, I'm sorry, okay? Because you read the press and they say, oh, these ISIS people, these are medieval, etc. No, they are imitating what the West has been doing for 500 years. Now, is that good? No, that's terrible. That's terrible. And we need, as a form of colonial Islam.
No, please, because there are lots of people waiting for questions. So we'll take last, there were one here, and I have to end with a woman. That's just to put you in a situation where you cannot say no. It happened to me yesterday. So we can start here. And by the way, just one thing about, you know, it's a very old legal opinion about that you can find in Madahib that women, not women, you know that? It's just distorted. That non-Muslims or people of other faiths cannot enter mosques. So it might be that Lyoté was just Maliki in the way he was looking at it.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Ramon, for this mind-boggling lecture, as always. And I was just having a very concrete question with regards to the very successful project of Europe to create this narrative, the historic narrative. Just a small anecdote. A few days ago, I was helping my nephew for a presentation, my 10-year-old nephew, and he's attending French school, of course. And the same narrative is Christopher Columbus discovered Americas in 1492. And I was really shocked, and I know this is still the case, and this is what is still being taught in schools over the world. And unless you do this effort to decolonize and to try to critically rethink the history, this is not happening. And it's such a huge hegemonic power and structure. Sometimes it feels really discouraging. So in your opinion, how can we counter this? And I know it's by education, through education, but when you see that most, I don't want to generalize, but in Morocco, if you don't go to French school, then you're probably worth nothing, basically. That's how it's viewed. And on a side note, I want to comment on the metaphor you gave about Morocco and the fact that non-Muslims are not allowed in mosques, because that, I tried to break that rule by bringing my non-Muslim friend with me inside a mosque in Fez. And I had a very long and serious conversation with I think I mentioned this with the person who was responsible in the mosque, and he had no idea where that rule came from. So I was challenging him, and I was telling him, do you think we're still colonized? Like, do you know where this comes from? And he had no idea. So this is how bad it is. So he honestly thinks that this is in Islam, and it's a principle is extracted from our own religion, whereas it has no basis. So I was citing him verses of the Quran, saying that, you know, we've been created to know each other, and this is much more important than to kind of restrict the access to non-Muslims, etc. And that's how bad it is. And it's also very schizophrenic, because there are other mosques in Morocco where non-Muslims are allowed. So it's very contradictory. We're very far from the decolonial approach. So thank you.
So can we have the mic? It's there. Oh, it was you? It's here.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much, Ramon, for this very insightful speech. And I just wanted to have your opinion on the Declaration of Human Rights and all the other conventions which are accepted today, and also by Muslims as a supreme objective to stick to and to work for. And I think on the practical level, one can easily say that these declarations are declarations of white human rights in the practical level, because we see in the application that it's to protect, it's a double standard. But I'm not talking about this. I'm not talking about the practical level. I'm talking about the theoretical level. Do you think theoretically it's an ideal that Muslims should fight for? Or do you think even on the theoretical level they are declaration of white human rights?
Okay, it was you. Okay. If you go that way, we can take quickly 5. So if you are quick, can one and the other there. Okay.
So thank you for your talk. You talked about how we are in today's world, we're internalizing a lot of these ideologies and thought. And something that came across when you were talking was, you know, the particular example I use is during the Crusades, how that is kind of today especially seen as this, huge thing, and where we were sworn enemies from the beginning and stuff. And I just wanted to stress that in, you know, a lot of the undercover things, there was trade going on and a lot of relationships that were, you know, they were attending each other's weddings and stuff like that. And I think another part of that is that they kind of, this view that we were enemies from before, we'll always be enemies, that is a concept that's also kind of they always refer to history and use that as a thing and justify a lot of things that are happening today. Thank you.
Okay, quickly. And all the others, yeah, in fact, okay, go ahead.
So just a quick question. So you said, okay, so we don't want to imitate the West too much, and we don't want to be anti-Western because we're just inverting the model, and we were left with these two depressing options. Do you have another option that isn't framed in terms of the West? Thanks.
Last question.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. I have a question. It has a bit of an introduction because I'm following the course of the Critical Muslim Studies, and I'm trying to see the line that you are creating, and pretty much of it I can follow it, and I agree with it, and I think yes, you have to bring a new narrative, a counter narrative, and you have to deconstruct something, but I like a bit a fundamentalist approach, and then going back to the sources. And to me, it seems like in the first class you said that it moved from Unitarian Christianity to Trinity, and that being a kind of starting point and then moving on to the Descartes I. That's the line. Correct me if I'm wrong, but then you miss a whole lot of history, of course, and then. To me, it sounds a bit too easy to put that as a kind of starting point where the narrative began of the power structures that we are trying to deconstruct right now. And the power structures, I think it is also a huge part of our nefs from a psychological point of view. That is, it is just human beings that want to have power to survive, or etc., etc., and they're always creating a narrative. And is it, well, to set the point from Unitarian Christianity to Trinity, is that a bit too easy and just creating a new kind of scapegoat for us?
Thank you.
Okay.
So 10 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Let me begin from one question about the Greeks. This narrative that we begin in, that the origins of the West is in the Greeks, then the Romans, then Dark Ages, Middle Ages, they don't name that, Renaissance, Enlightenment, and so on. This is a linear history that was invented fundamentally in the 17th, 18th century, okay? The Greeks, 5 centuries before Christ, were not, before Jesus, it was not, how could you call that? The West, okay? You could see the work of Martin Bernal on this question, Black Athena, showing how the Greeks were a crossover of several civilizations, Phoenician, Persian, and Egyptian, and above all Egyptian, okay, which was coming from Bantu culture in Africa, okay? So this is something that is also, kind of erased from history, and everything is put there as the Greeks as the starting point. So I agree with you about this question that we need to come with different, and that goes back to your question. I never said that we jump. I mean, if you heard me saying that we jump from Trinitarian Christianity to Descartes, then probably you didn't listen to all my narrative on Monday and today. That is, you cannot make that jump this way, okay? There are many mediations in history, okay? I'm just putting moments here and there that we cannot see as, that created, let's put it this way, discontinuities. In the formation, to understand the formation of this global power structure that we have today, Western-centric, Christian-centric, capitalist, etc., And so I'm not making sweeping statement. You heard me this way, I'm sorry, but that's not where I'm going, okay? In terms of the question of modernity, I think the decolonial attitude have to begin from being disenchanted with modernity, but that's not enough, okay? Because you could be disenchanted and again, be hyper-modern without knowing it, okay? Just because you're just inverting the binaries, okay? And of course, disenchanted with the project of imperialism and colonization, okay? We have to be disenchanted with that too, okay? As a beginning, okay, to have a decolonial attitude, okay? But the decolonial attitude implies that it's not that we are just anti all these structures of power, it's that you also have to build alternatives to that, okay? Because if you don't build alternatives, you stay in the anti, and then you're just going to repeat again everything you're fighting against. So part of the move is to understand, to move beyond the idea that there is a this idea of the West, that they have imposed also this idea, we have swallowed it, because the way we think about the universal is one that defines for you what is good for you, you see? And because they have the superiority at the epistemic level, they impose on you a project by persuasion or by force, okay? But whatever you say is good for you is irrelevant because you're inferior. Your epistemology and your knowledge is inferior, you see? And this is how they play out the game to beat you up, because then they're going to say, you know, our knowledge is superior, therefore I am justifying doing X or Y, okay? And so the point I'm trying to say, we need to move into pluriverses instead of universal as pluriversal, okay? Universal as pluriversal. What does that mean? Let's take human rights. The concept of human rights, what they do with everything for the past 500 years, they take knowledge, like concept of human dignity. That's what human rights is about. That you can find in every culture, okay? Concept of human dignity. Now what they do is they take the concept, turn it into human rights, and then define it according to what Western mind of fact countries think is human rights, and then sell it around the world as the concept of human rights. And if you don't follow that one, then you're inferior to that definition, and therefore you're disqualified or discredited. This is how it works, okay? And so what will be a way to decolonize the concept of human rights is first to turn it into the concept of human dignity, which is what is at the base of the concept of human rights, is human dignity. And then do pluriversal definitions, which implies interepistemic conversations with the multiplicity of definitions of human dignity that exists in the world. That is, if the United Nations will be a structure of power that is pluriversal instead of Western-centric versal, okay, it should be then, developing concepts like human dignity in a pluriversal way that is, like a Messer will say, a universe rich in all particularities. A universal that is rich in all particularities. Not the kind of universalism that they're playing out, which is hiding the particularity defined in the universal, okay, to then sell it as the only sole definition of that universal. You see what I mean? And then anything else is inferior to that. This is the mechanism. So the solution to that is not now to take my cultural definition, and then turn it in the same way they do as the sole possible universal, because then we fall in the traps of the inversion, you see? So the way out of this dilemma is then bring epistemic diversity to the conversation. That is, bring pluriverse of meanings in everything we're doing. That is, from Islam, from indigenous cosmology, from other perspectives. And then we can bring the tradition of the Western man to the conversation, you see, as long as they come to the table in a humble attitude, listening, open to dialogue, and not thinking of themselves at the center of the conversation. Because the moment they enter the room and think of themselves at the center of the conversation, then there is a monologue, okay? Or if we behave like they enter the room and we're all watching them and trying to please them, then we are in the same problem from the other side. So it's not that I'm anti-West or anti-European. That would be silly, okay? There are many things we can learn from there. But it has to be as part of this pluriversal, interepistemic, inter-spiritual conversation and dialogues, from which then we can build together a world where many worlds are possible. Not a world like the Zapatistas say, not a world where only one world is possible and the rest are impossible. You see, this will be, I think, the decolonial move, okay? Now, that entails values. You need to have values, okay, from which to depart to do this. We need to have ethics, you know, and when we, in our prayer of decolonial, we're calling for decolonial ethics, okay, etc. You know, so this is a long conversation I cannot answer here in 10 minutes, but, and I'm not trying to put here an escape, it's just that 10 minutes, it's impossible to go into this, but I can refer you to Nelson Maldonado Torres' work on decolonial ethics, okay? Have developed this question further, and the question of, and for example, the work of Islamic ethics that is being developed under your project and your leadership, and so on, and then Enrique Dussel, Ethics of Liberation. There are many projects that are going, you know, from different epistemology. It has to be diverse. It cannot be one only, you know, a tradition defining for everybody what is. It has to be diverse, but this pluriverse cannot become another way to melt everybody into another universal, you see, where then you hide once again with defining the universal. The universal have to be, in a sense, as a pluriverse, have to be an ending point, you see, where you have these multiple conversations as, you know, equals. And so the Human Rights Project, I will say, yes, you're right. Right now it's a white human rights project. Right now it's a Western-centric. I would say that in the politics of the world today, many movements have to use it. And I can understand that for pragmatic reasons. So I'm not moralizing with movement that have to use it the way it is. Okay? But your question is more at the theoretical level. And at the theoretical level, I would say we need to move beyond these narrow definitions in which only Western man definition of human rights is the one that prevails in the conversation, when in fact there are many other definitions of human dignity, and if the United Nations will do their job correctly, they will have interepistemic conversation to come up with more complex definition, more broader definition, more comprehensive, more inclusive definition of human rights, in which you have the universe will be rich in multiple particularities instead of the way it's now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.